Over the past 8 weeks, or this is the 8th week today, we have been looking at an introduction to the Old Testament. I'm not going to recap as I did in the earlier weeks what we have covered, but just simply to say that if this talk is to be meaningful, it probably is a good idea to have watched at least some, if not most, of the earlier talks. Last week we looked at the theme of the exile, and it was a particularly short talk, and I just want to recap and add a few things in about exile before we go into the return from the exile and the intertestamental period. The exile, as I said last week, was in a series of waves. What I didn't mention is that the exile included not only those who were carried off into exile, but those who were scattered by the exile. There is evidence in the book of Jeremiah that a whole group of people fled to Egypt, and they became part of what the Jews called the diaspora, the dispersion. And it certainly would be true to say that from the time of the exile onwards, more Jews have lived in the diaspora than have ever lived in Israel itself. As I tried to say last week, the exile was for the Jewish people almost inexplicable. Hebrew history had been built on the promise of Yahweh to protect the Hebrews and to use them for his purposes in human history. Their defeat and the loss of the land promised to them seemed to them to imply that their faith in God's promises were completely misplaced. Everything that they held to be true had to be abandoned or radically reinterpreted. Such a crisis can precipitate for anyone profound despair or a profound reworking of our worldview. For the Jews in Babylon and the diaspora, it did both. Many of the writings of that time, Lamentation, Job, take on the sense of a despairing quality. The subject of Job is the subject of suffering itself. But the Jews in the diaspora and in the exile were able to protect their faith. And their faith was protected largely because of the prophetic interpretation of the disaster as judgment. Judgment and punishment for disobedience. In the absence of a temple and the temporal sacrifices, there was a heightened emphasis on the law, and especially the importance of the Sabbath. The faithful Jew became in the exile the one who strictly keeps the law. Worship structures shifted to the synagogue, the Levites, and the scribes, and a whole new way of worship and of being Jews came into being. With the exile came a resurgence in ancient Jewish tradition as the exiles looked back to their heritage and their Mosaic origin in an effort to revive the original religion and to reconnect with God's love. Another factor that featured prominently was that the prophets of the exile, particularly Deutero-Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, all were prophets of restoration, prophesying that God had not abandoned his people, but would rescue them and bring them back. So, as we've asked each week, what does the exile have to say to us about God, about ourselves, and about our dealings with other people? Well, firstly, about God. Israel's history shows how easily we co-opt God into the little world of our individual and national desires. And when the edifices we have created crumble or are threatened, of how our faith is thrown into confusion. Hard times, though, are not the time to abandon faith, but rather to hold fast to what we know from the past to be true about our faith. And in the midst of that confusion, to re-examine our faith while entering more deeply into the life of the faith, just as the Jews did. What do we learn about ourselves? Like Israel, we want God to fit into our plans and desires, to bless us in all that we do. But we need to understand and recognize that the difficult times may well be the way that God uses to lead us into new understandings and to tune into new ways of faithfulness and obedience. What do we learn about others? The prophetic voice was constantly a voice calling Israel back into intimate relationship with God and into a relationship with others. We need, before the crises hit and our world collapses, to hear and take seriously what God says about justice and love and mercy, and to seek to make the covenant relationship that God desires for all of us visible in our lives and in our communities. Now let's move on to the return. While it is relatively easy to construct what appears to be a chronological account of the return of the exiles and the rebuilding of the temple, the reality is actually much more complicated. It is very difficult to determine with any degree of accuracy the dates and times of Ezra and Nehemiah, the two key proponents of the return. There were 6 kings on the throne of Persia who shared common names: Darius, the first and the second, Xerxes, the first and the second, and Artaxerxes, the first and the second, who also go by other names. And the texts do not allow us to clearly distinguish between which king is being referred to. And depending how one dates the events, one can have Nehemiah returning before Ezra, or vice versa. Nevertheless, allowing for the difficulties just mentioned, this following seems to be the most commonly held conservative approximation of the return, which took place in a series of waves over a period of about 90 years. The Babylonian Empire was conquered by Cyrus, the king of Persia, hailed by the prophets as God's Messiah. In 539, Cyrus issued an edict allowing the exiles to return home and to worship their own gods. Part of it was a strategic move, simply to pacify the gods and to gain their approval for Cyrus's own empire. At that point, Sheshbazzar is made governor of Judah by Cyrus, and Ezra, if Ezra is the first of them, leads the first return of people, which probably numbered no more than about 1,000 people. He is given the treasures that had been taken from the temple, and he returns to Judah to work on the rebuilding of the temple. King Cyrus dies in 530 and is succeeded by a son who gives Zerubbabel, the grandson of the king, and Yeshua, a Jewish priest, permission to lead a second group home. According to Ezra, over 40,000 return in the second wave. But they are met with growing hostility from the neighbors that threaten Jerusalem and certainly the people. And work on the temple stops for a period of probably 12 to 15 years, when the Babylonian governor of the section known as the Trans-Euphrates writes to the king asking who had authorized the rebuilding of the temple. The decree of Cyrus, which had been buried, is rediscovered and work begins again, and the temple is completed in about 516. About 50 years later, Ezra is given royal authority by Artaxerxes to renew the religious practices in Jerusalem, and he returns again with about 5,000 people. On reaching Jerusalem, he calls the people together about the thorny issue of marriage between Jews and Jews and non-Jews. And the Jews agree to purify themselves by divorcing their foreign wives. And Ezra puts in place a process of self-government. The final return happens about 15 years later, when Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, is asked to go to Judah in order to rebuild Jerusalem and to repair the city walls. His request is approved by the king, and he returns with a military escort. Despite fierce opposition from external enemies and neighbors, and threats of war which necessitated armed guards, and that each worker on the walls of the city bore weapons, he manages to rebuild the wall in just 52 days. The prophet Micah writes at this point, and he talks into something that Nehemiah speaks to as well. Huge economic injustice that has already crept into the life of the returned exiles, where the rich are getting richer and the poor are being deprived of what little they have. And Nehemiah urges them and sets the example in returning to the poor fields and houses and remitting all their loans. Micah speaks powerfully into that situation. What is clear in reading the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and the post-exilic prophets, especially Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, is that when the exiles returned from Babylon, they experienced many bitter disappointments. Both Ezekiel and Deuteronomy had promised so much that the people expected an era of great happiness and of material prosperity, of a restoration beyond their dreams. However, despite the help and encouragement that had been given to the exiles by the Babylonians, the returnees experienced miserable living conditions. The land was neglected, buildings were dilapidated and destroyed, and the people who had remained behind had become, to a large extent, careless and indifferent towards their religious obligations. And to make matters worse, the neighboring states were openly hostile towards the returning Jews. While a number of those who returned, while the number of those who returned sounds large, most scholars are agreed that it was only a small minority that returned. And despite the promises, life in Israel after the exile was hard and was only exacerbated by internal conflicts and divisions among the returnees themselves. The plight of the returnees has led a number of modern biblical scholars, including Tom Wright, one of the leading New Testament scholars in the world today, to posit the theory that actually the Jewish community never really saw the return from exile as the return from exile. It remained some future event, which, says Tom Wright, is fulfilled only by Jesus. Let us move on to the intertestamental period. The intertestamental period covers roughly 400 years between the last of the writings of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament texts. It's often been called the silent years because many scholars have held that it was a period where God revealed nothing new to the people. Although none of the books written in that period were accepted either into the Hebrew or the Protestant Bibles, most of the books of the Apocrypha, which are formally recognized by the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, were written during this period. The Anglican Church accepts the Apocrypha as useful for instruction, but not doctrinal. The history and developments of what happens in that 400 years is very complex and could rightly deserve its own talk. But because it has really no relevance for the Old Testament itself and serves simply as a link between the ending of the Old and the New Testament where we pick up, I'm going to give a very, very abbreviated thumbnail of that period. The Persians, under whose rule the Israelites were allowed to return home from exile, ruled for about 200 years, but were defeated in 331 by Alexander the Great, who swept through the region and introduced Greek rule. Alexander required that Greek culture be taught and followed in all the conquered lands. He continued to allow religious freedom, but within the context of Greek thought and lifestyle. The Hebrew Old Testament at this point was translated into Greek. Alexander did not live long, and when he died, civil war broke out between his generals, and the regions ultimately were divided amongst the generals. The area where Israel lay, which was known as Judea, was then ruled by a series of people until a man appeared, one of the descendants of the generals, a man called Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means light. But his nickname was Antiochus Epimanes, and Epimanes means the mad one. It is a telling nickname. When Antiochus Epiphanes took over in about 167 BC, he did not allow religious freedom. He clamped down immediately on the Jewish ways of worship and sought to impose the worship of Greek gods. Matters came to the head when, having overthrown the royal priesthood, or the line of the priesthood, he went so far as to defile the temple with unclean animals and the building of a pagan altar, which Jesus refers to as the abomination of desolation. Revolt broke out in a little rural town under a rural priest called Mattathias. Mattathias was ordered to offer a sacrifice of pigs on the altar. He refused to do so. And when another priest came forward and offered to do it, he slew the priest and then fled for his life, followed by his sons, particularly one known as Judas. His nickname became Maccabeus, the hammer. And the Maccabeans led a revolt that, over a period of 20 or 30 years, gained independence for Israel, who was able to restore then both their priesthood and their temple. And the Jewish feast of Hanukkah celebrates the rededication of the temple at this point. But their troubles were not over. Violent war, political intrigue, internal conflicts between rival groups within the Jewish community followed until, in about 63 BC, one of the groups appealed to Rome. And in 63 BC, Ptolemy conquered Jerusalem and put all of Judea under Roman rule. That led to the appointment of King Herod the Great as king of Judea. And that led to a nation taxed and controlled by the Romans, and to the situation where ultimately they executed Jesus on a Roman cross.
Thank you for joining us again this week. For anyone who missed the notice, the audio files for these talks are available for download on our website, which will be in the description. We hope you can join us again next week. Bye bye.